All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books Presents Online, Gustavus Stadler in conversation with Robin Wheeler for Woody Guthrie, An Intimate Life. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We are celebrating 51 years this year. We would like to thank all of our supporters, which has been an incredible, overwhelming amount this past couple of weeks. So thank you all so much for joining us and for supporting the bookstore. I would also like to thank the supporters of Gus and Robin and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We have adapted to the current situation and are bringing you the things that you love the most about Left Bank Books with curbside pickup, delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even, and select appointments available in the evenings. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. I think that right now it's a great time to kind of think about something else for a little bit, and Woody Guthrie is a great thing to kind of be a distraction. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for any of your friends. It's a great time to be thinking about the holiday season at left-bank.com. And purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff here through the most unusual of times. So thank you for your support. We need your support. And I will add that we are fantastically sold out of the book, but we have more already on the way. So that is a very incredible thank you all for purchasing ahead of time and for thinking about gift giving as well. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of the event, so you can type your questions as a comment. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. Tonight's book. This dismantles the Woody Guthrie that we have been taught, the rough and ready ramblin' man, to reveal an artist who discovered how intimacy is crucial for political struggle. Woody Guthrie is often mythologized as the classic American ramblin' man, a real Steinbeckian folk hero who fought for working class interest and inspired Bob Dylan. Biographers and fans frame him as a foe of fascism and focus on his politically charged folk songs. What's left unexamined is how the bulk of Guthrie's work, most of which is unpublished or little known, delves into the importance of intimacy in his personal and political life. Featuring an insert with personal photos of Guthrie's family and previously unknown paintings, Woody Guthrie, An Intimate Life is a fresh and contemporary analysis of the overlapping influences of sexuality, politics, and disability on the art and mind of an American folk icon. Part biography, part cultural history of the left, Woody Guthrie offers a stunning revelation about America's quintessential folk legend, who serves as a guiding light for leftist movements today. In his close relationship with dancer Marjorie Mazia, Guthrie discovered a restorative way of thinking about the body, which provided a salve for the trauma of his childhood and the slowly debilitating effects of Huntington's disease. Rejecting bodily shame and embracing the power of sexuality, he came to believe that intimacy was the linchpin for political struggle. By closely connecting to others, society could combat the customary emotional states of capitalist cultures, loneliness and isolation. Using intimacy as one's weapon, Guthrie believed we could fight fascism's seductive call. The Progressive magazine says Woody Guthrie, An Intimate Life adds powerfully to our understanding of a man who never shied from blending the personal with the political. And Billy Bragg, musician and activist, says Gustavus Stadler helps Woody Guthrie down from his pedestal as Dust Bowl icon and helps us to see him as a three-dimensional character he really was. Gus Stadler is the author of Woody Guthrie, An Intimate Life, which came out from Beacon Press Books recently, and Troubling Minds from University of Minnesota Press. His writing on music, literature, and politics have appeared in Public Books, Al Jazeera, Avidly.com, Social Text, and many other venues. He teaches in the English department at Haverford College and lives in the Philadelphia area. And tonight we are so happy to have Robin Wheeler. Robin is a St. Louis-based writer. She has been a regular contributor to the Riverfront Times, St. Louis Magazine, Sauce 11, and KDHX.org. Her work appears in the anthologies Knives and Ink, the St. Louis Anthology, and Woody Guthrie Poets, 2019. She's currently working on a memoir of her year chasing Woody Guthrie. You can find her rejected writings at robindwheeler.com. And now, without further ado, I am very happy and proud to be able to welcome Gustavus Stadler and Robin Wheeler for Left Bank Books. If everyone would please give a hearty round of applause as I welcome them to the screen. Hello!
Hello.
Hi.
I am so happy to be here. I'm so grateful to Left Bank Books for hosting this, and I'm really happy to hear that that the response to their financial plea has been really strong. I'm so happy to be here with Robin, who's a friend and somebody I've learned a lot about Woody Guthrie from, and music in general. So it's really exciting. Also, my parents were from Missouri. So I feel, although from Columbia and Kansas City, but I still feel a little bit of a, like a homecoming feeling being here. So I think we're going to start with, I'm going to read a little bit, maybe like 5 to 7 minutes from one section of the book, and then Robin and I will just shoot the shit for a little while about it. And I hope, yes, I hope we can help take your attention away from the mess that's going on out there, hopefully about to be resolved in a positive way, but yes. So I'm just to kind of frame what I'm going to read, the starting point for the book is it's after the kind of famous, most legendary period of Woody Guthrie's life, where he's riding boxcars, he's living among migrant workers in California. He's become, and that's kind of like the late 30s or so. He's become somewhat well known as a political folk singer. He moves to New York, actually in 1942, and he's kind of thinking about ways he can expand his career, what other kinds of media besides music he might be interested in exploring. And very soon after he gets there, he meets a woman named Marjorie Mazia, who's a dancer with the Martha Graham Company. And they fall in love while they are working together on a dance piece. And this is at the same time he's writing his autobiography, again, sort of like looking around for other ways to engage his talents. And obviously it's 1942, and the war is just, America is just getting involved in the war. So since the 1960s, many people associate the left with permissive views about personal behavior and self-expression, the letting it all hang out ethos of the hippie generation. For the radical left of Woody Guthrie's time, at least publicly, such matters held less importance. Particularly in a time of stricter gender roles, such personal concerns didn't signify as politically significant. The public sphere, the male-dominated worlds of politics, law, and finance, was the real realm of focus, the arenas in which oppressive class relations and racial injustice were maintained. Most leftists in the socialist or communist tradition believed that love and domesticity were false idols. The capitalist bourgeoisie idealized them in order to sap the time and energy of people who might otherwise devote themselves to challenging the dominant economic structure and overturning the ruling class. Significance of individual emotional experiences needed to be sacrificed to the commitment to a larger cause. Moreover, they were considered feminine concerns that ran counter to the masculine struggle for revolution. Guthrie's letters to Marjorie Mazia during the war years, however, show a committed leftist thinking along very different lines. They are the record of two people, one in particular, striving to make an intimate relationship between lovers historically and politically consequential. To an extent, these efforts reflected the Popular Front era, when a shift in focus from revolution, a shift on the left in focus from revolution to anti-fascism brought FDR supporting liberal Democrats into the fold with socialists and communists, making the left as a whole more middle class and female, and the more radical left less bound by ideological orthodoxy. But the first years of his correspondence with Marjorie make it clear Guthrie didn't consider this shift a watering down of the left's work. As the summer of 1942 turned into autumn, Woody Guthrie came to believe that his bond with Marjorie Mazzia reflected not only their attraction to one another, but also the possibility of fusing one's personal and political commitments. Their closeness seemed a medium for discovering ways to make sense of the world, to change it, to make their lives consequential. The magnetic pull between them felt mighty. Surely it was meaningful not only to them, but to history writ large. I'm going to skip a couple of pages. I forgot to mention one thing. One important detail is that they were both married to other people at the time, although Woody was estranged from his wife. But Marjorie was still married to a man who lived in Philadelphia and kind of commuting back and forth from New York between New York and Philadelphia, and had acknowledged to her husband that she was conducting this relationship with Woody Guthrie. Her husband was named Jones. Yeah, I guess it had kind of come out in the open by the time I'm reading from. So in early December of 1942, 9 months after their first meeting, and after several months of angry back and forth about Joe, Marjorie's husband, liberally interspersed with sojourns in the blissful space of their new relationship, Marjorie wrote Woody describing herself as at the low point right now and complaining that I really feel like a tortured person. His response illuminates how their correspondence afforded him an opportunity to think through the relationship between their closeness and politics on a global scale. He opens by assuring her, "I'm sorry you're crying, Mama, and I wish I could hold you until the tears all run out." He describes the snowflakes falling outside the window of his Charles Street apartment, comparing them to parachutists sacrificing their lives, in this case to make the sidewalk cleaner or fill up rivers to hold up Allied warships. And to her falling tears, which she writes, "Will be like oil, Mama, to grease our machinery to get us where we want to go." He then described his view of the war's purpose. "We're fighting this war to end slavery, thievery, and loneliness. And it's kind of like a big school where you go to learn sometimes about these three things and to feel them inside you, taste them in your mouth, and see how useless and bad they are. Whip them personally, and then when you get to where you can lick them every time you meet up with them, you soon get to be a soldier, showing other people how to see them, know them, and destroy them too." The message to his beloved, "Your sadness allows you to feel what life under fascism with its embrace of slavery and thievery is like, at the most visceral, sensual level. Feel them inside you, taste them in your mouth. Think of your loneliness as a kind of knowledge taught through mood and the senses. Knowing it will help you fight it. Her personal fight against it, indeed everyone's struggle with bad feelings, qualified as its own front in the war." If there's a single argument of sorts running through the letter and others from this early period in their relationship, it's this: the vulnerability to hurt and shame that intimacy produces and solves is not simply analogous to vulnerability to political power, it is the same vulnerability. Thus, Guthrie, now addressing both his lover and a wider audience of anti-fascists, continues with an exhortation to study crying and the cause of crying, misery and the cause of misery, hate and the cause of hate, fear and the cause of fear, crime and the cause of crime, nervousness and the cause of nervousness, and study to know greed and fascism because they are one and the same thing in all of its 100 million disguises. Some people betraying such qualities have been seduced by fascism's ability to sound soft and sweet and tender, sentimental and moody, loving and kind, but in truth, fascism would like for you to think that all of the world's troubles are your own personal fault. Fascism would like for you to weep and hang your head and get so mixed up in your thinking that you'd walk into one of its own churches looking for some kind of personal salvation. Indeed, they discuss fascism not as a set of principles governing a state, but as an emotional state, or more nearly an emotional imbalance. The fascist creed wasn't present only in nations led by avowedly fascist governments like Germany, Italy, Spain, and Japan. It was a mood and a way of acting that existed in greater and smaller pockets everywhere, manifest in dispiriting behavior that just about everyone encountered virtually every day: carelessness, bullying, the denigration of self and others. Fascism worked by exploiting vulnerability, and virtually anyone could fall victim to it. And that's where I'll stop.
All right, I don't have to tell you this, Gus. That is my favorite chapter, and both for the way you wrote it and also I'm not unbiased because that grouping of letters is where my research centered. This time at the end of 1942, beginning of 1943, when he and Marjorie were still separated geographically. And oh, by the way, she was pregnant, which
Oh,
another of intimacy and physicality to what we're talking about. And I absolutely, the whole idea of intimacy aligned with anti-fascism was one of the things when I was doing my research in the archives that just slapped me around and gave me a different worldview. But you have a whole book that we need to discuss that goes beyond that. And there's so much, and just so many great ideas going on. I'm going to jump off from the point of, you mentioned Marjorie being a dancer with Martha Graham. She went on to have her own dance studio. That was her career. That was her life. There's one part, I believe it's in that same chapter, where you have an excerpt from one of Woody's journals, I believe, about the condition dancers are in, that, you know, they're creating this physical art and yet they're banged up and they're bruised. And I had this thought while I was reading that, you know, this is a hiding that dancers do, that they're creating this beautiful physical form of art when they're bleeding in their toe shoes at the same time.
Right.
And I'm tying that in to, there's a lot of Woody overcoming this shame that comes from being a rural Oklahoma person at that time, of the situation with his family. And we see Woody through your book really fighting that shame and succumbing to it at times. I'm thinking in terms of, like, on page 144, you know, he's there's a part where he's trying to hide the symptoms of his Huntington's disease, and, you know, wanting to carry around a liquor bottle so that people think he's drunk instead of suffering from Huntington's. And then later on towards the end, where there's a part where he's blaming capitalism for like 90% of all mental illness, which he might not have been wrong on that. Might have been onto something. But that's, I wanted to kind of kick off that point on the role that shame plays in your book, and if you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely, that just became such a visible part of his world to me as I spent, you know, however many months in the archive. Just how, you know, throughout his life, feelings of shame, you know, of being shamed, of the risk of being shamed, of how to, like, as you say, sort of disguise shame, was this running theme. And it all goes back to his childhood in a small town in Oklahoma, and his mother, who suffered from Huntington's disease, although it's not clear that they knew exactly what it was. But Huntington's disease, if people don't know, sometimes called Huntington's chorea, CHORREA, is a extremely debilitating condition that has both physiological and cognitive effects, and it comes on very gradually. It's genetically transmitted. You begin to kind of lose your ability to control your limbs slowly, and you know, it becomes kind of like a tremor, and it becomes quite violent. Like the movements become quite drastic, and it's often associated with dementia, mood disorders. So he, as a very small child, saw that happen to his mother, who became a kind of outcast in this small town, who was, you know, like the sort of town, town outcast. And they used to, they had a very strong bond, probably maybe stronger than his other siblings, and his mother used to take him to the movie theater to sit in the movies all afternoon so they wouldn't be visible to anybody they would sit and watch Charlie Chaplin movies in the dark. And, Charlie Chaplin, this great artist of the body too, or, kind of like an artist of the vulnerable, kind of out of control body, but beautiful. And that's really how I started to see his attraction to Marjorie, Mazia, and to dance. This kind of random thing happened where this other dancer, a friend of Marjorie's, another Martha Graham dancer, had really liked Woody's music and was like, "Hey, why don't I get him to do music? Do something with us." And she and Marjorie went over and tried to persuade him. And it seems to me like he was really instantly attracted to exactly what you're talking about. I mean, the physicality of the dance, but actually like the damage of the dance and the kind of persistence through the damage that, again, you're talking about. And he writes about, he actually wrote 2 articles for a dance magazine about his experience working on this production called Folksay. The choreographer was Sophie Maslow. It's been revived every once in a while. It gets revived. And yeah, I mean, the articles really focus on that, the strength, and not that they're. I mean, he acknowledges what kind of pain and damage they go through, but nevertheless, as they persist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting to me that he's able to, especially that early in his life, at age 29, 30, in those years.
Yeah.
Right before he turned 30. He's able to see that, but then with his own illness, as it comes on, he immediately, or not immediately necessarily, we don't know, but how he just goes back to that embrace of shame. How it kind of comes and goes.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of think it's pretty consistent.
Think so?
I mean, yeah. And he's just finding he's finding better and worse ways to cope with it, and and then obviously it's getting harder as he does begin to get sick, and he doesn't really know what's happening to him.
Yeah, and he was, I know, blaming it on his drinking.
Yeah. I mean, he found a very therapeutic and very, productive, beneficial way of coping with that in this relationship with Marjorie, which continued till the end of his life, even though they divorced before he entered a hospital permanently for the last 10 years of his life. Marjorie continued to be, his companion and to bring the kids into his world and all of that.
Well, even though he remarried too, and he did.
Yeah, he did remarry and then re-divorced too.
Yeah, which actually that's a perfect move into what I wanted to talk to next. And I don't know if you get these questions when you talk to people about having written about Woody. I get asked all the time, especially by women. It's like, well, wasn't he kind of a womanizing scoundrel? And I find myself having to explain that, well, one, you have to kind of look at the time period compared to now, different social mores, things change. But also in looking at this relationship with Marjorie, where they had this intense long distance courtship while they were both married. And then he was gone in the Merchant Marines,
right?
Got married while he was deployed. And then divorced as the symptoms of Huntington's came on before he was diagnosed. They both remarry, and yet she is his companion to the end. I mean, there's the photo of him getting the, I think it's the Department of Interior award. It's one of the last photos taken of him with the cigarette dangling out of the corner of his mouth. Just, that's the only really sign of life. And she's standing there behind him with Arlo. Just kills me every time I see it. But one of the things that really just examining their relationship has gotten me to thinking about is just how they completely obliterated this idea of the nuclear family that was about to become the norm, you know, as their marriage was ending. And that, no, he wasn't just a scoundrel, that, you know, this was, I think they were kind of ahead of their time in the way relationships are changing. But I mean, I promised people we would talk about Woody's sex life. So that's where we're going.
Yeah.
75, right at the beginning of the chapter, after the one you just read from, you make a point of pointing out that Huntington's is not necessarily responsible for the sexually explicit writings that followed in the years he was married to Marjorie.
Right.
And, you know, further down, we've got where he compares Nazism to sexual repression.
Yeah.
And that institutions disciplining sexual expression, you know, I lost my train of thought on that, but you know what I'm talking about. I'm going to let you talk about that.
Right. So I mean, if you look at a lot of commentary on Woody Guthrie that's come before, it concentrates on the earlier times, the kind of Grapes of Wrath years, the Okie Minstrel. That's what the Hal Ashby movie is about. It ends before he gets to New York. So in biographies, with at least one very good exception by Will Kaufman, the later years tend to be treated as years that he was controlled by the illness, and that everything that he did was somehow damaged by this encroaching illness, which is in fact impossible to say when the symptoms started to emerge. But it becomes a kind of convenient way of writing off certain parts of his work, like his erotic writing, like writing that is more kind of modernist, avant-garde, formless. That's not just, you know, that's more interior focused and not just focused on politics. I mean, it literally is this kind of like, you know, this kind of get out of jail free card for a biographer to be like, oh, but you know, that was just the Huntingtons acting up, and that's why his later recordings aren't as good or whatever. And I really wanted to counter that. I really wanted to investigate the presumptions underlying that, which I think are ableist, essentially. I mean, you know, he was suffering with a form of disability. He was making art under those conditions. Those conditions are super interesting, and they made him create super interesting art. And like, I don't, but again, as you said, though, I also think there is a problem in just saying the only reason he was writing about sex was because he had Huntington's, and like Huntington's makes you uninhibited or something like that. I mean, that was a long running interest. It, you know, it became more of a poetic interest. And also, you know, he had this really intense relationship to Walt Whitman's writing. That was also longstanding, which he had a friend named Will Geer, who people might remember as Grandpa Walton, if you're old enough, this radical actor, and who was gay, actually. And they bonded over Walt Whitman when they met in the 30s, about their like love for Walt Whitman. And in a way, he's really, his writings about sex are really Whitmanian, and they're really, and I think it's part of, although he wasn't gay, and he doesn't sort of explicitly treat Whitman as like homoerotic poet, but he does tune into this part of Whitman that's kind of just like polymorphously perverse, like as Freud, which is a term Freud uses, like just like, you know, sexual everywhere, like, you know, like everything, every person, everything. I want to flirt with every person in the world. I want to like, I can be aroused by almost anything, you know, and you know, like, yeah, there are times when that gets really creepy, like when he writes unsolicited letters to women about that stuff. And that's bad. And that's, you know, that actually landed him in jail. But but yeah, I think he is really bucking a lot of the cultural trends that we associate with this post-war era, and even in the family, even in his like actual kind of nuclear family relationship, he became for a time, or for a few years, the main caretaker of the daughter that he had with Marjorie, and he would, because Marjorie was working in her studio, and he was, an unemployed musician or whatever, a lightly employed musician.
His mother-in-law taught poetry.
Yeah, right. And and then he started, writing down her like the things she would say, and like little things poems she would write and stuff. And like, then he started basically collaborating with her, writing children's music. And, you have these two wonderful records of children's music. They're still in print. That really emerged out of that relationship.
By the way.
What's that?
They make the best baby gifts.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're fantastic. But anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, it was in some ways like Marjorie and Kathy had a conventional nuclear family form, but then inside the family, the way it operated, it was pretty interesting, pretty unusual, I think.
Yeah. Well, and Nora tells stories about, being a little older than toddler age, and, having her babysitter Ramblin' Jack Elliott.
Oh, God. Yeah.
The stories about them slipping rum into the kids' orange juice to
good way to get them to go to sleep, right? Yeah.
Yeah, which it was the early 50s. Yeah, those things happened.
Yeah.
In talking about Huntington's sexuality and such, you and I talked about this yesterday. I love the fact that towards the end of the book, you used the term unruly bodies, which Roxane Gay has used at length in her writing. And when she uses it, it's in terms of her large Black female body and how unacceptable that is in our society. And I was just struck when I saw that you used the term too. And it was also towards the end where you're talking at length about some of Woody's last works before he lost his ability to use a pen or a pencil, when he was turning to graphic arts, when he was drawing these very abstract images. And specifically, I wanted to go to the notebooks from the archives that are titled Look Away, Southern White, and Southland Tourist, where he goes into graphic detail in his art about lynchings and such, and how that ties in with the unruliness. And we're looking at these art depictions of Black people that are being molested and lynched. And, this is how whites retained ownership of Black bodies post-emancipation. And you have awesome things, incredibly thoughtful things to say about that.
My sense of this later period before he finally enters the hospital for good, maybe the last 4 years, the time when he first gets diagnosed with Huntington's, and he spends like an entire summer in a mental hospital until the final hospitalization. I feel that the reason I think the term unruly body came up for me, was because he was losing control of his body, which is a symptom of Huntington's, and he was being subjected to kind of treatment, but also like disciplinary methods to try to control the body, to try to normalize his body. And I just lost my train of thought. In this hospital.
Yeah, the treatment. He ended up shock treatments, even.
Right. He ended up having shock treatment. And realizing that there's a kind of, I mean, I think he was always looking for sort of political collectives, and he starts to do that in the hospital. Like he starts to think about like how can the we men on this ward like start to think of ourselves politically in a way, or how can we talk to each other in an empowering way? How can we face our shame? Or it's actually quite it's more like, why can't we do these things? It's it's very actually like it's like a lament more, but he's thinking in those political terms that he would have thought about, in terms of class or something like that before. He'd started thinking about race pretty early on too. And so just really tying, seeing the body as like this kind of place where maybe some kind of, and shame about the body as a place where maybe collectivity could emerge. And then at the same time, like the same years that's happening, he's also learning a lot about race and anti-Blackness. He had a really good friend named Stetson Kennedy, a folklorist in Florida, who had like worked with Zora Neale Hurston and stuff, and had like gone undercover in the Klan, and was just a really committed anti-Black activist. And he learned a lot from Stetson, who was also tied to some of the most radical figures, Black figures in the Communist Party. And so that's kind of increasing his consciousness of like militant anti-racism. He went to this concert that Paul Robeson put on in Peekskill in 1949 that was attacked by white supremacists, or the audience was attacked as they were leaving violently with rocks and fists, and the police took part in the attack. He called it the worst thing he'd ever seen, and he said it's the worst thing I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot. Like hundreds of people.
After he had been in World War II and
right,
twice. Yeah.
I mean, miraculously nobody was killed, but they were chasing people in their cars, like all of this horrible stuff.
There's photos and artifacts from the riot, and it's unreal that nobody was killed. Just the sheer number of people, and
So I think something in these years is really changing. Becoming like sort of more critical or sophisticated in ways thinking about race. And he starts to kind of think about his own past, which was in this, a southern part of Oklahoma. I think it's considered part of the South, the Confederacy, or, a continuation of the Confederacy. His father was a vocal white supremacist. His father almost certainly took place in a notorious lynching that happened outside his hometown the year before Woody was born, a lynching of a mother and a child, Laura Nelson and L.D. Nelson. It's a fairly famous image, which I chose not to reproduce in the book, but it's of a mother and a like teenage boy hanging from a bridge with the entire town, or a huge chunk of the town, posing on the bridge in their like best finery, taken by the town photographer, like completely framed as this like civic, monument. It
was people would bring picnics.
Right. Yeah. So then he starts creating these images of lynchings that are really different, that are really chaotic. And he this book that you're talking about, where most of the paintings appear, is, I mean, I call it the Southern White book because he scrawls Southern White on the cover and on every page of the book, like regardless of what is on the page. Like there's a page that has some kids' drawings on it, and he writes Southern White over it. But then there are all these like representations of racial violence that he writes Southern White over. The word Southern and White over. Or white only in some cases, I think. It's a really striking document. I think I called it something like the last, like the major work of his late career or something, which I think it really is.
Well, then after, I mean, the other thing people always ask about with Woody now is the anti-Trump senior songs and letters and such. And yeah, this was a couple of years after that even.
Right. And I think that's also evidence of his evolving and, increasingly sophisticated view of race, because what set that off was, it was a couple of things, but it was whiteness that set that off. Like he's looking around his apartment courtyard and he's like, these are all white people. Like it wasn't that he witnessed something happen to a Black person or, and even like my elderly liberal Missourian mother who's, like, I don't think she notices how white her retirement home is, or whatever. Like, it's not something that her generation was like sort of trained whiteness as a kind of object of study. And it seems to me that he had that revelation.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that fed into that book, that notebook, and those paintings.
Yeah, I revisited some of this. I have the Woody Guthrie artworks.
Yeah,
compilation. And I went back through that as I was reading that chapter in your book, and a lot of quite a few of the pieces that you described are in the artworks book. And yeah, it's I wish everybody who's listening could see what we're talking about, because yeah, Woody had some things to say about race, and Shane has some things to say to us, I think. Hi, Shane.
Oh, I was just coming to be ready.
Well, I think we were getting to a pretty good spot, other than I was also going to just throw in that at the very end, Gus, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned Bob Dylan, and that's the connection everyone knows. But I thought it was really interesting that instead of Woody passing the torch to Bob, you had Woody passing the torch to Allen Ginsberg. And it's the torch that he picked up from Walt Whitman. As a writer, I love that, because I'm a music lover, but I view Woody as a writer. And that was it. I just, I love that you made that connection. I love that you made that connection. That's the next book.
Yeah. I came out of it seeing him as a kind of proto-beat in a way, but not like Kerouac as much as like Ginsberg or Burroughs, because I think both of them were also really tuned into the way that institutions shape and repress sexuality. They were both queer, obviously, and that's where I think to the degree that Woody has any relationship with queerness, a lot of it is in this kind of critique of the disciplinization of sexuality.
Well, and he definitely had no qualms about having close friendships with queer men.
Right.
Which was not necessarily a common thing at that point in time, and not an open thing.
It's not clear to me how open there was about that, or intimacy can involve sharing agreeing to not talk about things. Right. That might have been what was going on. Who knows? I don't think we'll ever know, but yeah. But that was a very, next to Marjorie, that was the most powerful relationship in his life.
Yeah. Okay. That was it. I just love that you made that, from Whitman to Woody to Ginsberg. That got my writer's heart going. So
it's great to hear.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are watching and you have a question for either Gus or Robin, you can type those up in the comments section and we will get to those. And we're going to start with a question from Susie Q. Susie says, I'd love to hear Gus talk about his experience in the archives at the Guthrie Center and if he has a favorite thing that he found in there.
I'll throw out the caveat. Susie's my best friend. So
okay, now that makes me nervous.
Could be.
But that's such a nice question. I had a wonderful experience in the archive in Tulsa. The family, I've had some experiences with other archives that have not been good. Archives that seem to see their goal as protecting the material from researchers. And that's not the case. I think Nora, Woody's daughter, who ran the archive for years and years, just set up a kind of atmosphere that encourages people to dig and doesn't censor also. And there's like, there's a lot of material in there that could be considered compromising, especially some of the sexual writing. And yeah, there's just maybe they have some stuff at home that nobody knows about. I don't know, but there's they're basically open to that. It's a nice size. It's like, it's not huge, but it's not tiny. And it's beautiful. It's just like, his journals are works of art. And in some ways, this is what really drew me in initially when I first went to the archive to like, I thought I was working on something different that had very little to do with Woody Guthrie necessarily. But as soon as I opened up some of his journals and saw these like beautiful pages of writing with watercolor paintings over the fountain pen writing, I was just entranced by this man and like the creativity and the almost like compulsive relationship to like marking paper, whether it be writing or painting. I got this really strong feeling of like, he likes to feel paper. He likes to rub paper, I think it was a really sensual experience for him. So some of those journals were I think the most magical things. There's some, as Robin was mentioning, this book, Woody Guthrie Artwork, that Nora co-edited maybe 15 years ago. And that's a beautiful book. It's like a Rizzoli, art book, like high quality art reproductions. And a lot of the most beautiful pages from the journals are in there.
Yeah.
Really nicely reproduced. They're hard to, the licensing stuff makes it hard to display publicly in events, but if we're being strict about that. But yeah, those were kind of my favorite things. People sometimes ask me, this is kind of a really different side of, like a flip side of the questions. People sometimes ask me like, what was I the most surprised by that I found? And what I realized, like the first time I was asked that, I had this thought immediately. And then I thought, God, I must be really naive. But like, I was really shocked to see that his doctors were informing on him to the FBI. So like when he was in mental hospitals being interviewed by psychiatrists, they were giving the FBI information about his condition. And he was never like officially blacklisted, and he was never submitted to the same kind of harassment as like Pete Seeger, for instance. But they were prepared to do that. They were keeping tabs on him. And, eventually, like, I guess because of these contacts, I think like the last line in his FBI file is like, he's basically something like, he's too sick to care about anymore, but that really shocked me. And I guess I shouldn't have been shocked after like Guantanamo and all of that, but yeah.
I tried to look up and see if the Woody Guthrie Artworks is still available, and it doesn't look like it's still in print. So.
Yeah, it's been out for a couple of years.
Yeah. Mary is actually stealing my question and wording it much better than I would have. So Mary would like to know how both Robin and Gus's paths led to these wonderful writings. So how did you get to Woody?
You first.
Huh?
You first.
Okay. I mean, I think he was somebody that my father admired a lot. My father was a liberal, not really a lefty, but a liberal, and but culturally, he really admired the work that Woody did. Although I have to say, like, I grew up not listening to Woody Guthrie, but like Pete Seeger sings Woody Guthrie, which I realized it's like Woody was too punk for my parents. Basically, like they needed to have that kind of more that sweeter Pete Seeger veneer on it. But I admire him, and then actually my father passed away, and I think I got interested in like I just decided to read a biography, like in some way as a response to that. And the thing that drew me in was actually my academic work. A lot of it is on history of sexuality, theory and representation of sexuality. And there was this anecdote that I'd never heard before about him being arrested on obscenity charges. And this was because of a letter that unsolicited erotic letter he wrote to a woman. And he was jailed, but also put in a treatment center for sex deviants. And I was curious to find out, and it was run by Quakers, which my college is a Quaker college, which made it especially interesting. But anyway, he was in this treatment center that was like 80% gay men, like men who had been picked up on the street in parks or subway bathrooms for having sex with other men. So he was kind of fed into this homophobic medical system, psychiatric system. His offense was considered like on a continuum with what those men had done. I initially just wanted to find out more about that center, and that was why I went to the Guthrie archive. And then I got seduced by the writing. I went to look at how much writing he had done about it, and there's not a whole lot, but then everything else hit me, and including the context for like how interesting it is that he was in this kind of queer space. Yeah.
Okay. I'm glad that this was asked, because I almost mentioned this, as a way of introduction. The way Gus and I met was hanging out in Tulsa at this event that happens every year. And I was kind of drawn to him because it's a lot of people that you would describe as folkies, even in the academic realm. And I'm looking at Gus thinking he's the one other person here who probably came to Woody through punk rock, which was how I did it. Because I did not become a Bob Dylan fan until I was well into doing the initial research on my book. I didn't get Bob until I got Woody. I came to Woody by learning This Land Is Your Land, part of it, y'all know, in elementary school. And then realizing about 8 years ago that my favorite musicians, Wilco, the Mermaid Avenue albums that they did with Billy Bragg, where they took Woody's words and put them to music, The Clash and Bruce Springsteen were all so heavily influenced by Woody. And I thought it was Woody Guthrie's centennial year. And I thought I should probably learn some more about Woody. And I started a little research writing project just for fun. And like Gus said, just got sucked into everything, because everything is there. Everything about how to be a human being was right there in the words of these songs. So that's how I came to this.
Yeah, definitely punk.
Yeah. Now, people don't realize that Joe Strummer's first stage name was Woody.
Yeah.
So, there's a whole tradition that was influenced by Woody that has nothing to do with the folk revival and Bob Dylan. And, there's this whole thread of protest music that is the basis of punk rock. And it all came from Woody.
And people sometimes ask me questions about Phil Oakes, and I'm like, yeah.
Oh, Phil was pretty punk rock too, though.
I need to learn that still.
Yeah. I need to learn more, but yeah.
Yeah.
Do you get into a lot of the musical influence in either of the books that you're? So, like, do you continue the story into today?
Mine does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Mine doesn't really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. A good chunk of mine is about Woody's influence now.
So you can read Gus's book now, and then when your book comes out, Robin, it'll be the perfect companion.
Well, and like I said when we were talking, he read part of my favorite chapter because, and I'm biased because it's the area that I did the most research on, that it just put everything together in my brain. So, yeah, with what Gus was reading at the beginning, that's where I see a lot of threads that run from that time in Woody's life that can be applied directly to right now, which one of the things I was going to mention, I noticed this yesterday. On the last page of Gus's book, there's a line that politics are felt in people's bodies. And if that does not resonate with you today, you're Amish. You've had everything turned off, because that's where we are as Americans. We are feeling this directly, and these are things that Woody was writing and saying and living.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was another, maybe in the background of the project, was a kind of interest in how we get really, I mean, the reasons that we vote the way we do, we get caught up in things that are like not just a platform of positions, but that have to do with the candidate. And I think it's not just something as dumb as like a cult of personality. There's something about particular candidates that they represent an orientation toward the world that isn't just abstract. That's a set of feelings, and they're better or worse at inspiring those feelings in other people. And I think Obama was great at this, and unfortunately Trump, for his people, was great at that too. I mean, for Obama, was this kind of hope of the post-racial era. For Trump, it's like the feeling that people who don't deserve things that you deserve are getting them, and that's basically white supremacy. But those are emotional or affective things that really drive electoral politics in this case. And I don't think they're simple or superficial, or I think they're real, very real, and need to be thought about more. And I think that Woody had this kind of, I mean, I think, sort of like I said in the excerpt, that he sort of, that's where his understanding of politics started. It was like feelings, the feelings aren't just like the offshoot of the political issues. It's like that the feelings are where are the political issues in a sense. Like there's no separating them at all.
We have one more question. I know that it might take us a little bit over time, but if you're okay with that, I am too. All right. So Marie is asking, his closest influenced musician is his son Arlo. Do you talk about him in the books?
I don't. I had this kind of ongoing argument or discussion with myself as I was writing about whether I would try to interview him and Nora, who I know because of her involvement in the archive, and she's a very, very nice person and very open and down to earth. But they were really young when their father was still alive, and for most of that time he was very sick, and they've been asked about it a lot. And I just felt like, I mean, part of it is I'm shy. And I usually work on much older topics where I don't have living people involved. But I also just felt like I didn't want to, just reanimate that kind of traumatic time for them again. I felt like it was likely I would just get some kind of understandably canned answers that they have to cope with the trauma of that time. So no, he doesn't figure in the book, or his music doesn't figure either. I
mean, he does a little bit as a child, because you do tell you do write about how, as Huntington's started to degenerate Woody's temperament and his physicality, the effect that had on how he treated his family. So it is heartbreaking. And yeah.
So there were incidents where he hit Arlo and Marjorie.
And that was when Marjorie said, "It's time to go."
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, if you want some sad scenes from Arlo's childhood, they're there.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for doing this event, for writing the book, and thank the audience for coming out tonight. Remind everyone that there are copies available at left-bank.com, and we can mail them to anywhere in the country. You can pick them up if you're here in St. Louis, and we are happy to be able to provide them to you for potential gifts for the holiday season.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you for inviting me to participate, Gus. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for doing it. This has been a blast. And thank you, Shane, too.
Yeah, thanks, Shane.
Absolutely.
And love you guys.
Yeah. Love you too.
All right. Well, everyone have a good night, and we will see you next time.